So today is our Impact Lab Open series, and for those of you who have joined us outside of the SBS community, Impact Lab is a co-curricular pathway for impact-driven MBA students at the University of Oxford. We take 50 students every year through an immersive leadership journey, looking at ways to address social and environmental challenges. This year's application closes tomorrow. But before we opened the application this year, we decided to open up with a series just to give people tasters about the type of content that we cover on Impact Lab, the kinds of discussions that we have, and also hopefully to spark some discussions at the business school with our incoming MBA students to broaden access. And at the same time, since we've gone online, to open up to whoever has an interest to discuss these issues as well, which is really exciting. So today's session, we're going to be looking at impact investing for equality. So you'll see what we do in the Impact Lab curriculum. Sometimes we go really broad and sometimes we go narrow it down as well. And because we're looking at a very wide variety of social environmental challenges, we do this throughout the Impact Lab just to give us the opportunity to deep dive on some issues that we think are really important and then to sort of like funnel it out again. So for those of you who joined last week, we really looked at demystifying systems change and really the concepts of systems change, and we shared some systems innovations and some system change approaches that made a significant difference in the next decade. And if you didn't catch that session, it's available on the Skull Center Canvas page, and it is also now available on YouTube. So we go into understanding the broad range of systems and systems mapping and not being afraid of complexity. And then we kind of deep dive into understanding root causes as well. So why are we choosing impact investing? We could have chosen any area to kind of deep dive in. And the reason why we chose impact investing is that at this current moment in history, there's this, and Tara will share this throughout her presentation today, there is huge inequalities within the system of impact investing. And we're going to do a little bit of a deep dive into impact investing. Today is going to be a taster session, and then on the Impact Lab, we'll go a little bit into more detail. So hopefully today will give you a broad overview of impact investing as a lens in which we explore inequalities within systems. So I'm going to introduce Tara Sebra Collier now. She's a fellow at the Skull Center, and she's our impact investing lead for developing our module on Impact Lab. Last year, she ran the Gender Finance Lab with the MBA students, so it was extremely popular, and we just learned so much from her. She too is an Oxford MBA alumni, so she really deeply understands your alumni experience. She has 15 years experience in the intersection between inclusive development, international strategy, and impact investment. She is currently the gender lead at the Shell Foundation and a visiting fellow with the Skull Center. And she's also her own angel investor focusing on impact in ventures as well. She is a co-founder of a new network of BAME and women angels who are deploying 10 million into startups in the USA currently. She has a strong focus on Africa and emerging markets, and she's worked on one of Africa's largest small medium enterprise investment funds. She's also worked for the World Bank, the IFC, Ernst & Young, and really excited that we will manage to continue to work with this year with the Skull Center. So what we're going to be doing today is exploring impact investing for equality, specifically looking at gender finance and racial equity investing tools that will be coming out towards the end of this year and next year as well. So just so amazing to be able to work on what's happening currently globally and exploring these approaches and hopefully having a critical lens when we do that as well. So over to you, Tara.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. Well, afternoon. Hi, nice to see you all. I'm going to be sharing a presentation. As Bronwyn alluded to, this is a taster. It's just to get people introduced to the idea of equality impact investing, explain why it's important, explain some of the nuances without getting into in depth about tips, tricks, metrics, or any of that. And I hope that it'll entice those who are interested in knowing more to join the session. And with that said, I'm going to share my screen. Yeah, here we go. Great. So, impact investment, obviously, as you all know, has grown in the past decade from just above 12 billion assets under management to now 715 billion assets under management. So it's been massive growth. And yet you see bigger and bigger players coming into it. And that means that we need to pay even more attention to prevent against impact washing and ensure that the players truly are really aligning people, planet, and profit. And that also creates distortions which increase the risk of impact investing being used to actually further inequality. And why does that even matter to impact investors? I mean, if you're getting rid of greenhouse gases, or you're helping children get access to education, or you're making really cool maternal health aids, why does it matter about inequality? Well, one reason it matters is impact investors are being held, the majority of impact investors are being held to address UN Sustainable Development Goals. SDG 10 is reducing inequalities. But as I'm going to get into, it goes deeper than that. So why do we even care about inequality? I mean, you've got Japan and Ethiopia equally inequitable. You've got some of the fastest growing countries like India, deeply inequitable. And you also have some rich countries like United States, which are pretty inequitable and getting worse. So why should we even care? Well, there is a there is a correlation between better equality and better human development. It's a light correlation. It's not a deep correlation. But as we're going to get into next, there's several negative externalities that come with societies becoming more inequitable. So societies are basically losing out on gains from inequality. So if you guys aren't familiar with the human development indicators, before when we had the Millennium Development Goals, we had these indicators. They look at things like typically, percentage of people getting access to secondary education, the number of doctors per person. They're to measure human development in terms of quality of life based on a few different social metrics, which typically are relating to health and education, but also things like political representation. So just based on inequality alone, we would fall from a global human development index of 0.682. And 0.682 means the global average is pretty close to Morocco. So it's pretty good. We would fall to 0.525, which is about the level of Madagascar, Mauritania, or Uganda. I don't know if you guys have been to any of those countries, but if you've been to those countries, you'll see that there's a definite difference in level of access to everything. And that's how much as a humanity, as a human family, we're losing out on in terms of our level of inequality currently. But there's other studies that are showing correlations across a whole bunch of areas, which you can see add up. So when you have more inequitable countries, they have slower progress on human development. And that makes sense because there's not the requisite investments in public goods that will have that rising tide, which will lift all boats. When you have more inequitable societies, you tend to have an increase in crime because the have-nots are trying to balance out by taking from the haves, and they're often driven to more desperate extremes. You have a drop in democracy, which then leads to increased rates of social unrest and rebellion and a higher likelihood of failed states. There's also a correlation between worse levels of inequality and worse performance on reducing greenhouse gases or compliance with the Paris Accords, which means that more inequitable countries are more likely, or societies are also more likely to be more environmentally irresponsible, leading to global planetary devastation from the way we're all acting towards each other as a society. So these are a few reasons that if you didn't care about inequality before because you came from wherever and it didn't really affect you, and maybe you came from a really equitable country, maybe this will help put in perspective why this is important. What's really interesting, inequality has gone up on the global radar and the global agenda because COVID called attention to inequalities within Western societies and across countries. And what's crazy is that even though we all know that COVID worsened inequality, what not a lot of people know is that COVID was exacerbated by inequality. So places where there were greater levels of inequality, you would expect, as you can see on this chart, places with a higher population density to have a higher likelihood of having a greater number of fatalities, and you would expect places with a greater population to have a greater number of fatalities. What I didn't expect to see until I was preparing this presentation was that more inequitable, the correlation with inequality or your Gini coefficient was just as high as population density in predicting COVID fatalities. So you can see that clear correlation. And then of course, there's a lot of stats out there on this as far as COVID, but inequality created conditions for COVID to hit certain countries worse than others, but COVID also worsened inequalities that were already there. And there's a few examples. Most of these examples are across the US or the UK or the broader global north, which are the job losses concentrating in the working class. Women in the US accounted for about 60% of the job losses. Companies ran by people of color in the US were more than twice as likely to close due to COVID. And then in the US, both women and people of color that own businesses that were getting payroll protection and government relief, they were significantly less likely to get approved for loans. So existing gender pay gaps, gender wealth gaps, racial wealth gaps in the US now got worse because of COVID. And then finally, one thing that we all know is that, globally in the past 20 years, hundreds of millions of people have moved out of the extreme poverty and extreme poverty. So whether you're using the definition of 1.25 a day or $2 a day, tons of people moved out of that echelon of income. And now tons of them, at least 100 million, are likely to be moving back unless we actually have adequate strategies to intervene. And then finally, we expected countries with the worst health and infrastructure to have a greater burden in caring for the poorest. And that's why when you look at what's happening in India with their spikes in cases, you can see how COVID is worsening inequality, whether we're looking at this in terms of race, gender, global south, global north, income groups within all of these different societies. So this is the time when impact investors, as they're preparing strategies to address COVID relief, they need to now consider inequality. And the great thing is, the silver lining in all of this devastation that everyone's dealt with over the past, 9 months, well, actually 7 months, is that it's really called attention to these inequalities. And so some impact investors are starting to actually allocate resources to this. And the field of equality impact investing, I expect it's going to really take off over the next few years. The field of gender lens investing has been growing and growing and growing over the past 10 years. Most noticeably in the past 5, I believe it went from about 100 or 200 million AUM in about 2014 to 2 billion 5 years later. So gender lens investing was already having that uptick. And now, because of this global phenomena and this global tragedy, which has made people more aware of inequality, I would expect the other aspects of equality impact investing to get an uptick. But we'll get into that in a second. So just to close this out, as far as why should we even be thinking about this? I've shared a bunch of the downsides, But what's really interesting for impact investors, most impact investors, especially international impact investors, are focusing on SDGs. And inequality is one of the only SDGs, well, it's one of a few SDGs that has almost no real major trade-offs, and that actually could potentially synergize or accelerate progress on many of the other SDGs. So if you're looking at, whether you're looking at education, whether you're looking at healthcare, in general, creating more inequality, addressing gaps across groups, and of course across countries, would lead to upticks towards these other sustainable development goals. And that's not the case with all of the goals. So some of the goals for, agricultural development or economic growth can sometimes create trade-offs with some of the other goals, but with inequality, it does seem like a rising tide does have potential to lift all boats. With all of that said, inequality is getting worse. So just a few stats about this. In 2009, the world, sorry, I can't see this actually. The world's richest, this is in the way. Can you guys still see my slide?
Yes, we can. Yes, we can.
Okay. Yeah, so in 2009, the world's, there, okay. 380 richest had as much wealth as the poorest 50% of the global population. And in 2018, just 26 billionaires had as much wealth as the poorest half of the global population. So whether you're looking at the global south or the global north, with very few exceptions, societies are becoming more inequitable, and there are some exceptions. So the Middle East, interestingly, is one of the notable exceptions. And when I refer to the Middle East, this is heavily influenced by the Gulf countries where there's significant amounts of social spending. Nevertheless, the world's richest today, the world's richest 1% have more than twice as much wealth as 6.9 billion people. And the interesting thing is that the inequality is growing across countries and within countries. And theoretically, we would just say, okay, let's resolve this by policies. Let's just have a global universal basic income at the country level and globally. But come on, guys. You guys have enough years of job experience. Some of you have policy experience. You know why that's not going to work. If you're looking at this, even at a national level, most countries don't have the budget for it. They can't get the buy-in for it. If you're looking at it internationally, geopolitically, there's not much way to make that happen. And experiments with universal basic income globally have just been, a handful of countries, if that. They've just done a few. So we know that there's not going to be any likelihood in our lifetime of us to equalize the world or have a big shift when it comes to equality through policy alone. So that means that there's a real role for impact investors to step in. And as I mentioned before, impact investors have been stepping in when it comes to gender lens investing. And now we're seeing inklings of impact investors wanting to address some of the other aspects of it. But another reason why governments could not do it, and this will then point to a key aspect that impact investors will need to consider, is even if you have a universal basic income, come for a journey with me here. If you have a universal basic income, you give it to everyone in all over the world. I'll give a few examples. If you give that in certain East African and Asian countries where women don't get access to land rights, they can't get bank accounts without their husband's approval, they really can't get credit without their husband's approval. In a generation, what you'll have is everyone starting out with the same income, but women not being able to invest in assets. As we all know from Thomas Piketty, capital accrues faster to capital than labor. So in a generation, you'll have the men who had access to certain credit or land rights significantly being able to increase their wealth in ways that the women were not able to, even though they actually were all given the same income. Similarly, you could do the same thing in the US, where African Americans and Indigenous people have way lower likelihood of being approved for loans and are often charged higher interest rates, even if I and my white male counterpart, Joe Schmo, both got the same universal basic income of, let's say, $50,000. Joe Schmo is able to get angel investment. As we know, in the US, about 90% of venture funding goes to white males. I'm not able to get the venture funding as a Black and Indigenous woman, or maybe I just get a really small quantum of what he got. I'm also not able to get a bank loan at the same rate. We have the same business idea, but within a generation, he's grown a unicorn company, but I haven't been able to catch up. And imagine that extrapolated across millions of people. These are just two randomized examples to just point out how even if you give a universal basic income, there's other factors. At Spelman College, where I did my bachelor's, we learned about this concept of the matrix of domination, which was race, class, and gender. And it basically talks about one's access to everything, but especially power in a society or an economy. And the idea was that you have your socioeconomic status, you have your race, and you have your gender. And you'll get privilege for certain things. So obviously, if you're the dominant gender in society, so you're a man, or the dominant race in American society, which would be white, or you come from an upper middle class or millionaire class, whatever class, you'll have those privileges, but you'll also have other penalties from not being placed on that matrix where you get the same access to opportunity and power. In being a global citizen, so I've now lived in Cuba, Peru, Jordan, UAE, South Africa, Angola, UK, I realized that while that matrix of domination is a really useful framework for understanding how things work in America, it's not how it works everywhere. So if you live in India, it may not be about your race, but it could be your caste. It could be your religion. If you live in many other societies, there's religious groups that are marginalized, that are not given the same access to opportunities. Obviously, physical ability. In some societies, your sexual orientation, or whether you're gender binary or non-binary, all of these things affect people's access to power and opportunity. And no matter how you're dealing with it, if you give universal basic income and you don't consider these other barriers to access to power and opportunity, eventually the same distribution of wealth will replicate. So all of that is a long background to explain why when we're addressing impact investing for equality, we can't just say, oh, we'll do this in a city and we'll do it for the poorest. No, you actually need to look at gender differences, racial differences, depending on the society, religious differences. You actually need to consider creating opportunities and access for those who have been historically marginalized, because otherwise you could be shooting yourself in the foot. And I've seen this with a lot of impact investing programs in Latin America, for example, where there's historical barriers to indigenous and Afro-descendant populations, and they do a lot of gender lens investing, which does not reach those populations because they fail to consider it. Or even impact investment programs that have a lot of benefit in generating smallholder fiber farmer livelihoods and impact, but they're actually create worsening, or at least not addressing, gender asymmetries that mean that, yes, although in general farmer livelihoods are increasing, women's livelihoods are not. Women still don't have power in the household. Women still don't have the same amount of earnings from their productive output than men. They're still not able to get electricity. So why aren't we also addressing this? So these are the kinds of things that as impact investors, if we really want to be thorough, we'll start to look at the matrices of equality and access and opportunity. And that's part of what impact investing for equality is about. So today, as I said, we looked a lot at gender and racial equality, but you need to address this to the society that you're working on. So wherever you guys decide to impact invest or to do a social enterprise, or to work within a social enterprise, be cognizant of patterns of marginalization that have affected different people there, and the extent to which your investments or your enterprise activity is addressing them, whether it's further entrenching inequality or whether you can find a way to tailor your investment or your venture activity to improve it. And why is this important? Well, it's not just important so that we can say we're good impact investors, and so that we can say that we did a good job. As I mentioned with the SDGs, it actually has a lot of potential to synergize, accelerate, or supercharge our activities. So I'm just going to give a few examples from the context of race and gender. But once again, I invite you guys to tailor this to your local context. So if we're looking at impact investing to create, you know, a society that and an economy that's really propelling in an inclusive way, what would that mean for the broader economy? So if you're doing impact investing in, like, let's say the US, or no, even broadly, more broadly the world, if you're doing impact investing in the world and you were intentional about making sure all of the companies that you invest in were gender equitable, not just in terms of pushing them to recruit more women, but to promote those women, to ensure that eventually at the C-suite you have gender equity, so that we are creating a world where men earn the same as men, women earn the same as men. This could add 28 trillion to global GDP, just for gender, just for the private sector, the formal private sector. We don't know how much global GDP could improve by solving racial, ethnic, or religious divides. So could we look at, as I mentioned, Hindu, Muslim in India? Could we look at lots of other groups? But we have an example from the US. In the US, the racial wealth gap is anticipated to be costing the US economy between 1 trillion and 1.5 trillion between 2019 and 2028. So if we were actually able to fix people's access to employment, promotion, and capital, mostly in the formal private sector in the US, that's how much the US economy could benefit. Now imagine if we extrapolate that across the entire world. So when we're talking about our vision for a more inclusive world, a more economically inclusive world, where everyone across gender, race, religion, physical ability, sexual orientation has access to the same opportunities to build businesses or have careers and grow and progress, this would not only create a way more inclusive world, but also one that's way more prosperous. And I think that's a really key takeaway. So all of that as background to get you guys excited about impact investing for equality. And I hope that I've given some good rationale about why to do so is linked to all of our well-being and all of our goals for ourselves and for humanity. So impact investing for equality addresses typically across 4 pillars. Investing into traditionally excluded entrepreneurs, assuming that those entrepreneurs in that society have typically not had the same access to capital. And that's something that I've done. It's investing into organizations with diverse leadership and impactful, demographically inclusive value chains. So I'll give some examples later, but hopefully these are very clear. Investing into organizations that are focused on equality. So these would be organizations that, for example, are addressing the education gap, are addressing the healthcare gap, are addressing the investment gap. It doesn't really matter what is the status of their leadership, but it's about their activity contributing to that end. And then finally, building it out in the ecosystem. And that's what's starting to happen now. So you have organizations now coming up with their gender lens investing frameworks and their metrics and their employee guide, employee survey. There's a lot of different tools that people are using to build, whether it's their individual fund or the broader ecosystem, to create a common set of definitions. So these are the 4 pillars that equality impact investing is comprised of.
Sorry, Tara, I see your slides are out. It's back to the first one.
Oh no,
Yeah, if you want to get that so that we can follow what you're saying.
I'm glad you told me. How long has that been the case?
Just for the last two slides. So what you were making makes sense until you refer back to the slides. That's fine. I think
Okay.
you need to screen share again and then put us back there. Because your screen is not shared now, so you can reshare your screen.
Yeah, it's called MB. Yeah. Great. See it?
Yes, we got you there. If you could just make it full screen.
Yeah.
Perfect. There we go.
Okay, so this is what equality impact investing is. Now, there are some issues with doing that thus far. The idea of equality, while the idea of gender lens investing is quite, been around for at least 10 years, equality impact investing is more new because people realize like, actually, this is not just gender. Like we don't just have gender barriers, we have all of these other barriers. But the issue is that impact investment itself is not that inclusive and has its own issues with equality. I don't have global stats because obviously there's too wide of a continuum from the different kinds of organizations, whether they're, VC, PE, or more philanthropic, where they're based. It's just too hard to get that data globally. Although now there's two indices coming out, which are equity indices for international development and impact investing respectively, that will basically be rating all of these organizations in terms of gender, race, and I don't know what other metrics. But just to give an example, a few examples about why this is actually a bit complicated for the sector. The sector has gender and racial issues. So I've given a few stats. So in the UK, only 6.5% of board directors are from BAME backgrounds, and male directors outnumber female directors by a ratio of 2 to 1. So when you're looking at who's making investment decisions, it's not that different from the VC ecosystem in the US. It is a bit more pale and male, which means that when we're having these discussions about reaching communities which are historically marginalized, there's far fewer people who will have lived experience and who will have deal flow that's relevant to that. Same thing with the US. This data is in regards to foundations, which are at the presidential level or most executive level, about 90% white, which then creates this pipeline disconnect because you can see the social enterprises led by people of color can have as much as 90% lower unrestricted assets to the ones led by their white peers. And that a lot of that is because, the investment committee and the team will determine the pipeline. And then if the impact investment sector itself is not diverse enough, then that'll trickle down into who's actually getting impact funding. And that's part of the reason why when you look at the stats that came out about East Africa showing that 90% of impact funding in East Africa is going to companies led by Europeans and North American founders, a lot of that has to do with the fact that a lot of the funding is coming from Europe or North America. So that is a caveat that the sector has to deal with in wanting to embark upon equality impact investing. So just as a 30,000 foot view of what we'll be talking about in the course and what funds need to think about, I'm just going to give like a rundown. The first thing is defining the access for your context. And that means at the country or state or what regional level, whatever you're addressing, who are the groups that are historically marginalized? Who are the ones that you think have traditionally had less access to opportunity and power? Then making sure if you want to address this with your funding, that you're setting targets for representation of those groups at the IC level, but obviously the IC level is going to be determined by who you have in management. If you don't have people from that background in management, you need to think about your talent pipeline. When you start looking at the portfolio, you're going to find that there's actually various ways to contribute to equality. So we call these the lenses. I'll get into that momentarily, but you'll track your pipeline to see how the pipeline stacks up, and then you will adjust your strategies over time to improve the pipeline. And that could require that you make other investments in your pipeline. So for example, we said that we want to have way more women-led companies, but what we kept finding is that the women are earlier stage. And now that means that we need to actually back an early stage vehicle that will back more women, because if we keep it at the current stage, which is a ticket size of starting with, 300K to $1 million, far too many of the great women entrepreneurs will miss them because they're often in an early stage. And you also need to understand intersectionality across groups. I gave the example of Latin America before, where if you're looking at gender without looking at race, you're making a really big mistake. But we also need to look at that across our work. So if you're doing agriculture, who is benefiting, who owns, who has access to productive assets with agriculture? If we're addressing climate change, who is most affected by climate change? How can we find a way to address climate? If we find a way to address climate change, does it have a differential impact in women's access to time, to savings, to access to markets? And how can we build this into the way we invest, even if that is just technical assistance? And then another important thing is understanding and build complementarity with the ecosystem. So a lot of these things would be way too pricey for impact investors to address within a typical fund structure where you're earning 2%. Like you just can't put up, you just can't make these investments for every fund, which are far too long-term that it's possible from a return perspective. And that means that you're going to create partnerships. So for example, really good examples are the social impact bonds, but all kinds of results-based finance. So for example, this doesn't have an equality angle, but we were looking at backing mini grids. Mini grids have commercial viability challenges. So we've worked with donors and governments to set up a subsidy. So the subsidy, governments obviously are incentivized when they can get electric connections for people having access to energy. So if we can provide grant funding upfront, then that funding allows the energy companies to do their work. And then there's repayment upon every single connection. So that's just one example of like a results-based facility, which is an example of the ways that impact investors will need to do equality impact investing. Because if it's a typical fund structure, you just can't do all of these like free activities, investments in the pipeline, training, technical assistance. You can't do that and deliver the returns that you're expected to do. So you use partnerships to reach it. I'm going to give a summary of I know I'm slightly over, but I'm going to go about 5 minutes over, but we'll still have 10 minutes for questions. I'm going to give some summaries about gender lens investing and examples. So this is what we'll be getting to in the course. The main lenses of gender lens investing. I mean, obviously backing women-led funds is one thing that's starting to happen, and the women-led funds are actually outperforming, which I'm sure you can see in FT, and this is now starting to be cited a lot in LinkedIn. It's also supporting women as entrepreneurs. It's also creating equitable workplaces, and this means that workplaces where it's not just about having a high percentage of women in leadership, although that's part of it. It's creating workplaces where there's paternal leave, where there's non-discrimination policies, where there's mentoring, basically creating workplaces where women have any existing barriers completely cut out. Any barriers that women have traditionally had to go up the ranks in the company, to have a positive work environment where they're not discriminated or penalized for having children, for example, where all of that is resolved, and they have the same opportunity to rise as anyone else. In addition to, of course, having companies with a greater percentage of women in leadership. And those two are not always the same thing. So you can have a company with an all-male C-suite, with amazing policies, that eventually will probably reach gender parity in the C-suite because they're creating that environment. And you do have companies where it's women-led and it's still basically a sweatshop. So it's important that those two are split out. Obviously, Lens 5 is about products and services that serve women and girls. So these can be everything from, maternal health to menstrual hygiene to education. It could be anything, access to energy. But it's important that when you provide this, You're not just saying, oh, I have a solar panel and I have a pink solar panel. It's about finding ways to tailor the product or service so it's having an outsized benefit on women and girls, or that it's addressing unique barriers that women and girls face. And then finally, companies with women in the supply chain. So if you can show that, you know, whether or not your company is run by a man or whoever, if you can show you've got a ton of women micro entrepreneurs in your supply chain and you're creating, you know, that livelihoods for thousands of women, that's definitely considered a gender progressive company. I've got a few examples, and maybe you guys can chime in about which lens you think they are. So you can unmute and just chime in. We'll go really quick because I know I'm supposed to finish in about 5 minutes so that I can take questions. So Burn Cook Stoves, it's a cook stoves company. Obviously, conventional cooking in most of the global south, whether it's wood or kerosene, it has terrible health effects and is really shortening people's life expectancy. And the main users of that are women. So cook stoves are one that's addressing women and girls as, anyone want to chime in before I answer in 10 seconds?
Products and services?
Yeah, products and services. Another one we've got is one that we've backed, which is SMV Vahini. They're an e-rickshaw company. They typically have women are about 1% of the workforce in the transport sector. But with Vahini, they've basically outfitted these e-rickshaws, which are electric rickshaws, i.e. Carbon-friendly rickshaws, so that they have cameras, they have security, and they have preferential financing products so that more women would want to become rickshaw drivers. On average, the women who are doing it have about doubled their incomes. And we're in a workforce which is typically 1% women, they're getting close to about 8%. How does this empower women? Chime in. Feel free.
Workplace equity.
That too, also, but also women entrepreneurs, because in this case, the women who are the drivers are entrepreneurs, but they are addressing barriers, especially like security. Another one, Micro Lending Foundation, which they basically give loans, which go almost entirely to women. So these are a few examples of some of the gender lens case studies. Mommy, which is a maternal health app. It's actually got probably a gender and racial element because women of color are disproportionately affected by higher maternal mortality rates because of disparities in healthcare. So which lens is that? Chime in.
Products and services.
Services. Great. We're not going to go deep into investing for racial equity. I'm actually in the middle of having interviews with different impact funds about how their organizations are operationalizing this, but I just wanted to give a few examples. We don't have to name the lenses here. So Greenwood Bank, which if you guys know the rapper Killer Mike, it was created by Killer Mike, which is, it's a Black bank. It's focusing on Black and Latino and Indigenous Americans. Obviously, the mortgage access and the rates of mortgage in the US have a big disparity, so they're addressing that. Harlem Capital, they do early stage capital focused on underrepresented founders. It's not necessarily limited to Black founders, but it is a lot of people of color founders. Born, which basically has farm to table juice bars in the South Bronx. South Bronx is a relatively low income neighborhood, mostly Black and Latino in the US, where there's a lot of food deserts. So there's higher rates of obesity and other health problems. So they're specifically teaching about cultivation, but also providing access to healthy food at a better price. And then another interesting one, especially in light of the recent police brutality issues, there are some apps like those created by ACLU and ProTech which basically provide ways to track and report and record police brutality in real time. And it's unfortunate that there even needs to be an app for that, but it is an example of the kind of investment you could do to for a product or service that's addressing a unique barrier or challenge faced by a historically marginalized group. So those are a few examples. I hope that this has whet your appetite and got you at least thinking. I hope that as you take the boot camp in the lab, you start thinking about these lenses. And of course, in the session, we're going to go much deeper into the lenses. We're going to go into metrics, tools and tricks. Last year, we did some case studies. Hopefully, we'll do that again. So I hope that this has piqued your interest, and I'm happy to open the floor for any questions.
Thank you so much, Tara. Could we show some appreciation for Tara by using your reactions or clapping your hands for the time that she's given us this afternoon during lunchtime? It's really hard sometimes to feel appreciated online. So thank you so much, Tara. There was some questions. There was a few questions in the chat box while you were chatting. One of them was really about the capitalist system as sort of like, you know, as the ocean rises, so the boats are part of those rising tides in the system of investment. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Actually, I'm sorry. I was just talking. I was just talking the whole time, so I didn't look at any of the questions.
So there was one about sort of like the sort of like the rising tide of capitalism, and sort of like as we become wealthier, sort of like wealth is distributed more in society. And I think it's quite obvious that we've seen that system has been creating more inequalities. So there was a question if you had some comments about that. There was also a question about an increasing caste system in Silicon Valley, if you have any thoughts on that. And then when you were talking about universal basic income, there was a question about Sweden. Sweden has been so innovative, one of the most innovative countries, and how can they be so innovative if they have such a strong welfare state as well? So those are the 3 questions that I saw in the chat box.
Okay, I'll go one at a time. So, and I see another one from Dan as well. So the rising tide, it may be true that, yeah, as you create as you create economic growth, that theoretically the government could spend on health and education, et cetera. But part of why I pointed out these examples of if we had a universal basic income and we didn't address all of these differences. And by the way, I didn't even mention geographic differences at a state by state or geographic level, which you can even see here in England. There's a huge gap in the north versus the south. So you cannot take that kind of broad strokes approach to creating inclusive growth, because that would basically mean you're overlooking all of these social, political, logistic, financial constraints that may actually also operate along these demographic parameters, whether that's gender, whether that's race, whether that's geography. Even here in England, I hear that accents are a thing that defines people's access to opportunity. So yeah, you can't, there's a lot of evidence that there's these distortions that you would have to be tactical about addressing. Otherwise, you can't expect that everyone will benefit the same way. There's enough evidence that the barrier, people can't benefit the same way from economic growth if they all have different barriers. And sure.
What do you feel hopeful about in this space, working in the space you are at the moment?
I mean, for ages, funding has been going into, I'll just think, I can personally relate a lot to agriculture because it's something I've spent a lot of time on. And gender was addressed in a very like haphazard way, like, oh yeah, make sure there's some women farmers in the co-op, you know. And now people are being really strategic, like, no, you know, we also need to address women's land rights and we need to address credit. And, you know, women are better repayers. So when we're going to give agricultural products at the community level or try and reach community level, we should partner with MFIs. Like, people are driven to address gender equality in agriculture in ways they never did before, partially because the development finance institutions made the commitment to the 2X challenge. which was created in 2018 when they committed $3 billion to gender progressive investments, which are the ones along the lines that I showed you in the gender lens slide. So now that's making everyone want to find ways to integrate gender, whether it's agriculture, energy, and everything else. And so I'm hopeful that if we can do that with gender, we can do it with some of these other barriers too. And keep doing it with gender. Philanthropy play a role, and how can it add value versus results-based finance? Well, the philanthropy can also play a role in the results-based finance, like the SIBs as well. But in addition, philanthropy can de-risk in many ways, whether it's combining the technical assistance or investing in product innovations that make it so that companies can take that gender lens. So the example I gave you of the e-rickshaws, it would have been way too expensive for that company that was doing e-rickshaws to come up with a way to recruit women drivers, outfit the rickshaw so that they had cameras, link with access to finance, which was tailored for the fact that women have lower incomes. If they hadn't got grant funding, that was all done with grant funding. So I think philanthropy has a massive role to play in several areas of this, whether it's the de-risking, the innovation, the technical assistance, so many, especially because a lot of these things we have to try and test, and that takes money.
But that was a really amazing session, Tara, and just thank you for all the time you put into that research and just educating us today. It's just, I always learn something new every time you present. So thank you again.